Pilots ignore black woman, but in the worst moment, she takes control and shocks the world. It was supposed to be a simple red-eye flight, nothing more than a 6-hour stretch of quiet sky between Los Angeles and New York City. And yet, as the gate agent waved the final passengers aboard and the cabin doors began to close, the energy inside Flight 2285 shifted into that strange hush that always seemed to settle over people once the reality of flying set in. The collective resignation that they were no longer in control, that their lives now rested in the hands of strangers in a sealed cockpit. At seat 14A by the window, Dr. Zariah Monroe adjusted the sleeve of her soft gray blazer and placed her leather satchel neatly beneath the seat in front of her, her fingers still slightly trembling from the conversation she'd had just hours before with the FAA director in D.C. A final call confirming that her credentials as one of the lead instructors at the Advanced Aeronautics Institute had been verified again for the upcoming safety protocol simulations in Virginia. It had taken her over a decade of training, sacrifice, and impossible odds to earn her place among the few black women certified to instruct on commercial flight emergencies. And while her mind was already occupied with lecture notes and diagrams, she couldn't help but notice the two pilots strolling past her with the casual air of indifference she had become far too familiar with, men who, despite her impeccable record and flight hours logged, never saw her as someone who had sat where they sat, someone who once commanded a cockpit with steady hands and a clear mind. "Evening," she offered quietly as they passed. The older one, a tall white man with silver hair and a smug, easy smile, glanced at her without much thought, offering only a polite nod before continuing on. The younger co-pilot, sharp suit, aviator sunglasses tucked into his breast pocket, didn't respond at all. Zariah exhaled slowly, not surprised, not angry, just tired. Across the aisle, a woman was already half asleep with her neck pillow in place, while further back a group of college students whispered loudly about their weekend plans in Manhattan, oblivious to the subtle tension that still lingered in the air like static. She reached into her bag, pulled out her e-reader, and began scrolling through a bookmarked passage from her own graduate thesis on mid-flight decision-making under high-stress conditions. Ironically fitting, she thought. The plane pushed back from the gate. 35 minutes into the flight, with the cabin lights dimmed and the hum of altitude cradling everyone into a dazed stillness, Zariah felt the familiar drop in pressure that usually signaled turbulence. But this time, it came with something different, something off. The first jolt was minor, just enough to make drinks ripple in plastic cups. The second came harder, a sharp vertical shift that made a child in row 9 scream and a flight attendant stumble into a tray. And then came the voice, calm but clearly strained, crackling through the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing unexpected turbulence. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." Zariah sat up straight, her instincts already taking over. She looked around. The lights flickered briefly, and one of the overhead bins popped open with a thud, sending a laptop bag tumbling into the aisle. Then she noticed it. The flight attendants moving with less choreography than usual, eyes wide, whispering to each other just a bit too urgently. Something was definitely wrong. She unbuckled and gently approached the nearest attendant, a young man with a pale face and visibly shaking hands. "Excuse me," she said, her voice steady but commanding. "I'm Dr. Zariah Monroe. I'm certified in emergency flight response. Is your captain in control?" The attendant blinked, clearly startled. "Ma'am, please return to your seat." She leaned in, eyes fixed on his. "That wasn't my question." He hesitated. "The captain hasn't responded in the last 2 minutes. The co-pilot is trying to troubleshoot." That was enough. Zariah didn't wait for permission. She moved forward, past the curtain, past the galley, ignoring the calls from the flight staff, and reached the cockpit door, Locked, of course, but she pressed the emergency code she still knew by heart from her previous airline tenure. It beeped once, then again. Finally, it clicked open. What she saw inside made her heart pound. The captain slumped to the side, unconscious, with a cold sheen of sweat on his brow and a deep discoloration creeping up his neck. The co-pilot, young, clearly overwhelmed, was trying to radio for support, but the signal was fragmented and unclear, static drowning out every other word. He turned sharply as she entered. "Hey, you can't be in here." She stepped forward anyway. "You've lost your captain. You're not in communication with ground. I'm a certified flight instructor and former pilot with over 4,000 logged hours. Let me help you." He blinked. "You're not on the manifest as flight crew," he said defensively, even as the plane jolted again and the cockpit lights dimmed. "Because I bought a seat like any other passenger," she said firmly. "But if you don't let me assist, you're going to lose this aircraft." Another moment of silence. Another sharp drop in altitude. He finally moved aside. Zariah slid into the captain's seat with the fluidity of muscle memory, hands immediately scanning the instruments, her mind processing the engine readings, fuel levels, and altitude like they were second nature. She flicked the switch to emergency comms, cleared her throat, and calmly said into the radio, "Mayday, Mayday. This is Flight 2285. Captain is unconscious. I am assuming command." The response came, crackled, broken, but clear enough. "Identify yourself." "This is Dr. Zariah Monroe. I am certified as a commercial flight instructor. I have command authorization. We are experiencing system faults and possible environmental interference. Request emergency routing." There was a pause. Then Dr. Monroe confirmed. "Ground control is tracking you. Please proceed to reroute Protocol Bravo 4. We are with you." She exhaled. The co-pilot sat back in stunned silence, his earlier arrogance now drained away, replaced with something raw, something respectful. "You really flew commercial?" he asked quietly. Zariah didn't look at him. She was already adjusting the altitude and cross-checking their reroute pattern. "I didn't just fly," she said. "I taught people like you how to fly." And with that, she took the controls with a calm authority that radiated through every fiber of the cabin. For the first time in hours, the aircraft stopped shaking. And for the first time in years, someone saw her. Truly saw her. Not as a black woman in seat 14A, but as a pilot, a leader, and maybe, just maybe, the one person who could bring everyone home. The cockpit was quiet now, though the tension hung in the air like dense fog, thick, invisible but suffocating. As Zariah's hands moved over the controls, her fingers dancing over switches and dials with the ease of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. Even if not in this exact aircraft model, the co-pilot, still seated beside her, kept glancing over at her in disbelief, as though some part of him refused to process what was unfolding before his eyes. Zariah didn't care. She wasn't here for his validation. She was here to land this plane. "Speed stabilizing," she murmured to herself more than to him, though he heard. "Altitude holding at 32,000. Fuel looks balanced. No major pressure irregularities in the cabin systems, but this electrical drop needs to be monitored every 3 minutes. Possible transient fault in the APU relay." The co-pilot blinked. "You picked that up that fast?" She didn't look at him. "This isn't magic. It's competence." For a moment he said nothing. Then, "I'm sorry for earlier. Back at boarding. I didn't mean to." "Dismiss me?" she offered calmly. He shifted uncomfortably. "I just didn't know." "That I was a pilot?" she asked, her tone still even. "Or that a black woman could be?" Silence. Zariah finally looked over, not with anger, but with clarity. You don't have to answer that, but I need you focused now. The captain might be suffering from a pulmonary event, and I need you to go check on him again. If he regains consciousness, we need to know his level of responsiveness. The co-pilot nodded and stood, suddenly obedient, suddenly aware that this woman, this passenger he hadn't even greeted properly, now had the entire flight resting in her hands. In the cabin, passengers were starting to whisper louder now. Word had begun to spread. The captain had passed out and someone, a woman from the passenger list, was now flying the plane. I heard she's some kind of expert. They let a passenger fly this thing? No, she's a real pilot. I saw her in the cockpit. She looked like a professor or something. Zariah's name hadn't reached them yet, but her presence had begun to ripple down the aisles like a tide. Quiet at first, then gathering power. At the back of the plane, a little black girl named Layla sat clutching a teddy bear and watching the grown-ups panic in whispers. She looked up at her father, a man who hadn't said much all flight, and asked softly, "Daddy, is she going to keep us safe?" The man didn't answer immediately. Then, with quiet conviction, he said, "I think she already is." Back in the cockpit, the co-pilot returned with an update. "Captain's still unconscious. Pulse is better, though. I elevated his feet, loosened his collar, and one of the flight attendants is trained in CPR. She's watching him now." "Good," Zariah replied. "How's cabin morale?" He gave a tired laugh. "Well, they're not screaming. Let's keep it that way." She opened the comms again. "Ground control, this is flight 2285. DR. Monroe speaking. We have stabilized flight, but need immediate diversion plan. What's the weather window for emergency descent and clearance?" Ground responded a beat later. DR. Monroe, you are cleared for descent toward Street. Lewis International. Weather clear, traffic rerouted. Runway 16L is being cleared for emergency approach. Copy that. Beginning descent protocol. The co-pilot glanced at her again. "You're really calm." Zariah finally cracked the faintest smile. "You should have seen me during my first solo engine-out simulation. I was 21 and drenched in sweat by the time I landed. Confidence doesn't come first, training does." She paused, then asked, "What's your name, by the way?" "Derek. First Officer Derek Watts." "Well, Derek," she said, "get ready. We're going to need perfect coordination on flaps and throttle at 7,000 feet. He nodded. "Yes, ma'am." Zariah checked her watch. 2 hours left. Maybe less. She reached into her blazer pocket, quietly pulling out a small silver charm, a gift from her late mother, a stewardess in the 70s who had never been allowed to train as a pilot because that wasn't the image the airline wanted. Her mother had once said, "Someday, a girl like you will fly that plane, not just ride in it." Zariah rubbed the charm between her fingers, closed her eyes for half a second, and whispered, "You were right, Mama." The next hour passed with slow, methodical tension. Zariah briefed the attendants, coordinated with ground, and triple-checked every redundant system on the flight deck. She even coached Derek through the landing simulation one more time in case she lost consciousness or control. "Why would you pass out?" he asked nervously. "Stress does strange things to the body," she said. "I've seen it happen in situations far less serious than this. We plan for every variable, not just the likely ones." And then came the call from ground. "Flight 2285, you are cleared for descent. Begin vectoring to heading 310 and prepare for approach. Fire and rescue are standing by." Zariah straightened her spine, adjusted the headset, and placed her hands gently on the yoke. This was the moment everything would depend on. Not just the landing, but everything she'd ever fought for. The years of being overlooked, doubted, dismissed. Sitting in training rooms where she was the only woman of color, walking onto airfields where people assumed she was with catering, enduring the endless smiles that barely concealed condescension. She thought about how many times she'd been passed over for cockpit jobs she was more than qualified for. How many times someone like Derek had been given a seat simply because he fit the mold. But none of that mattered now. The sky didn't care about race or resume, only readiness. "Brace for descent," she said calmly. Derek, watching her, nodded with a new kind of reverence. And 38,000 feet above the world, a black woman began bringing down a plane no one had believed she could ever fly. The descent began with a subtle shift in pressure, the kind only a few passengers noticed. A gentle pop in the ears, a slight feeling of weightlessness in the belly, that hush that falls when people instinctively feel something significant has begun. The seatbelt sign dinged overhead, and murmurs traveled like electricity from row to row. But in the cockpit, there was no room for noise, only precision. Zoraya's fingers moved in quiet rhythm, adjusting the autopilot, flipping toggles, confirming indicator readings, cross-checking the airspeed with the vertical descent path on the glass cockpit screen. Her lips moved occasionally in a silent mantra, not of fear, but of focus. "Flaps set to 5, Derek said, his voice steadier now, following her lead. "Maintain heading," Zoraya responded without turning. "We'll reduce to 200 knots at 12,000 feet. Confirm vertical profile on path." Confirmed. They were in sync now. Not equals, not yet, but closer than they had been hours ago, when he looked past her without a word. Zoraya adjusted the radio frequency and opened the line again. "Street, Lewis Tower, this is Flight 2285. Descending through FL 180. Request vector to final approach, runway 16L. The voice on the other end was brisk, clear. "Flight 2285. Radar contact confirmed. Begin left turn to heading 265. Descend to 5,000 feet. Expect final clearance in 5 minutes. Wind calm. Rescue on alert." She nodded more to herself than anyone else. It was happening, and she had less than 15 minutes to make the most important landing of her life. Down in the cabin, the passengers were unusually quiet. The word had spread. The woman flying the plane was a civilian passenger. Or so they thought. An older white businessman in row 2 leaned over to a flight attendant. "Who is she really? Someone said she's not even on the airline staff." The attendant, a Latina woman with streaks of gray in her bun, straightened. "That's Dr. Zoraya Monroe. She's more qualified than most pilots flying today. She taught half the instructors at Langley." The businessman raised his eyebrows. "That true?" The attendant smiled faintly. "I Googled her 5 minutes ago. It's true." 3 rows back, a mother clutched her daughter's hand tighter and whispered, "She's gonna land this. Can feel it." But even in the growing admiration, there were pockets of skepticism. "She's not listed on the manifest," one man muttered. "Why does that matter?" someone else asked. "Just saying, would they trust her if she didn't look the way she does?" "You mean if she wasn't a black woman?" came a quiet reply. He didn't answer, but the silence was an answer of its own. Back in the cockpit, the city of Street, Lewis glittered below like scattered stars. The Mississippi River traced a lazy path in the dark, its waters catching slivers of moonlight. The lights of the airport came into view, parallel lines of brilliance guiding them toward Earth. "Flaps 10, Zoraya said. "Flaps 10, Derek confirmed. "Speed brakes armed. Gear down in 30 seconds. Check cabin status." Derek picked up the intercom and relayed the update, trying to keep his voice calm even as sweat began to bead along his brow. "Cabin ready," he reported. "Gear." Zariah checked her gauges. "Deploying now." With a familiar mechanical rumble, the landing gear emerged from the belly of the plane, locking into place. Outside, the wind picked up slightly, brushing against the aircraft like a test. One final resistance before granting safe passage. "Approach path is clean," Zariah said. "Wind speed confirmed at 4 knots from the east. We're good." She paused just for a second. "Take a breath," she said to Derek. "You'll want your hands steady." I've never landed in an emergency before." She turned, for the first time since takeoff, and looked at him fully. "You're not landing this." "We are." Inside the terminal at Street, Lewis International, emergency vehicles stood waiting at the edge of the tarmac. Fire crews, paramedics, FAA reps, all bracing for what might come. A reporter from a local news station stood behind a barricade with her cameraman, whispering into her mic. "We're being told this may be a passenger-initiated landing. Again, unconfirmed. But witnesses say the woman now at the controls is not on the original crew manifest." In an FAA control room across the country, a woman looked up from her screen. "Did she say Zariah Monroe?" Another man nodded. "Yeah, that's her." The woman chuckled. "About time the world sees what she can do." The runway stretched ahead like a promise. "Final checklist," Zariah said. "Gear down. Flaps set. Speed stabilized. Approach locked." "Roger," Derek replied, his voice almost reverent. At 400 feet, Zariah's voice shifted, firmer, more present. "I have the aircraft." "You have the aircraft," Derek said. Zariah's hands gripped the yoke gently but firmly. As the nose tipped forward with grace, the plane aligned perfectly with the lights below. Seconds passed like entire minutes. And then, with the smoothness of silk laid over water, Flight 2285 touched down. Rear wheels first, then nose, then a soft squeal of rubber as the brakes engaged and the plane slowed gently, gracefully to a halt. The cabin erupted into a stunned silence. Not cheering, not clapping, just pure, breathless awe. Then the applause began. Not loud, not frantic, just slow, real, earned. Back in the cockpit, Zariah let her hands fall to her lap and exhaled deeply. Her eyes didn't well with tears, not yet, but her shoulders shook with release. Derek sat beside her, staring straight ahead. "Holy!" Zariah smiled softly. "Now you've landed in an emergency." Outside, as the doors opened and passengers were escorted to safety, the ground crew stood frozen. No one had ever heard of a story like this. A woman, a black woman, not part of the crew, assuming control midair and bringing everyone home without a single scratch. Journalists began arriving. Flashes popped. Questions flew. But Zariah stayed back in the cockpit, just for a moment longer, pressing her fingers gently against the dash like an old friend's shoulder. "This bird flew because we let her," she whispered. Then she stepped out, into the lights, the questions, the crowd. Not for fame, not for praise, but for truth. The world needed to know what it had almost ignored, who it had almost overlooked, and who had saved them all. For the next 72 hours, Dr. Zariah Monroe's life unfolded in a surreal blur. Not of her own making, but pulled into a whirlwind of headlines, sound bites, opinion columns, and interviews she neither requested nor chased. Every major news outlet, from CNN to BBC to morning talk shows and aviation podcasts, wanted a piece of her voice. And not just because she had landed Flight 2285 safely, but because of who she was while doing it. a poised, brilliant black woman who'd stepped into a cockpit as a so-called civilian, taken command under pressure, and averted catastrophe with more grace than many career pilots could hope to muster. What shocked most people wasn't the skill. It was the fact that someone so qualified had gone unrecognized in plain sight. But Zoraya? She wasn't shocked. She was exhausted. In a quiet hotel room 2 days after the landing, she sat cross-legged on a modest sofa, her laptop balanced on her knees, a cup of mint tea growing cold beside her. The television in the background flickered with yet another headline. Hero passenger lands plane meet DR. Zoraya Monroe. Her photo appeared on screen. A candid image from 20 years earlier, back when she was a cadet in training. Helmet tucked under her arm, expression confident, sunlight casting a defiant glow across her skin. She chuckled softly. "They never cared before," she murmured to herself. But now that the plane didn't crash, the knock at the door was soft but persistent. "Zoraya?" A familiar voice called. She opened it to find her mentor, Commander James Hill, now retired but still carrying that air of aviation royalty. Salt and pepper beard, crisp blazer, and the kind of presence that made even airline executives straighten up when he entered a room. "I figured I'd find you avoiding the chaos," he said. "I'm not avoiding. I'm recovering." James stepped in and surveyed the untouched fruit basket on the table. "They've already offered you every job on the planet, haven't they?" Zoraya nodded. Commercial airline captain, FAA leadership track, book deal, even an offer to train celebrity pilots for some TV thing. "And I turned them down." James raised an eyebrow. "All of them." She sipped her tea finally. "I don't want to be their mascot. I don't want to be the headline version of me. I want systemic change, not just symbolic applause." James gave her a look of admiration that wasn't new, but this time it was deeper. "So what are you going to do?" She closed the laptop. "Start something that lasts longer than a news cycle." The next day, while reporters camped outside her building and social media exploded with the hashtags #Captain Monroe and #She landed it, Zoraya made a quiet call to the dean of her alma mater. "I want to launch a program," she said, "not just for pilots but for aviation leadership, one that brings in girls from overlooked communities, trains them not just to fly but to lead." The dean was quiet for a long beat. Then, "Name it. We'll fund it." Meanwhile, across the country, on a quiet airstrip in Ohio, the co-pilot from Flight 2285, Derek Watts, stood before a classroom of cadets, sharing what had become his most humbling memory. "I flew next to a giant," he told them, "and I nearly missed it because I was too busy thinking about her seat number instead of her skill set." The room was still. A young cadet, a black woman maybe 22 years old, raised her hand. "Sir, if that happens to us, if we're dismissed like that, what do we do?" Derek didn't blink. "You do what Dr. Monroe did," he said. "You stay ready, and when the time comes, you land the damn plane." In Washington, a group of aviation officials met behind closed doors, analyzing transcripts, recordings, and performance metrics. She responded faster than 87% of trained crews in similar emergencies, one analyst said. "Should we recommend her for the National Medal of Air Safety?" another asked. "Forget recommend," someone replied. "She deserves it." But Zoraya wasn't listening to any of it. She was already in a small classroom at a community center in Atlanta, sketching a diagram of a jet engine on a whiteboard for a group of 12-year-olds, most of whom had never been inside an airplane. "This is the compressor," she explained, drawing curved blades with blue marker. "And this is where the real magic begins." One boy raised his hand. "Miss Monroe, have you ever really flown a plane?" She smiled. More times than I can count. The boy looked at her skeptically. Did anyone ever say you couldn't? Zariah knelt next to him. All the time. He frowned. That's dumb. She laughed. It is. But I didn't wait for them to say yes. I just kept showing up. The class fell quiet, their eyes wide. Zariah stood and clicked the next slide. Now who wants to learn how to land? Every hand shot up. That night, she stood on the roof of her hotel, the city lights below twinkling like a quiet constellation, and for the first time since the flight, she allowed herself a moment to just be, to breathe in the air without the roar of engines, to feel her feet on solid ground. But she knew it wouldn't stay quiet for long. There were speeches to give, panels to sit on, barriers to break. Still, she smiled to herself, because maybe, just maybe, the world had finally stopped seeing her as a surprise and started seeing her as what she'd always been: prepared, precise, unshakable, a pilot first and always. News vans lined the terminal driveway like ants to a fallen sugar cube. Floodlights gleamed off every surface, camera crews scrambled to capture every word, and microphones waited like open mouths, ready to devour a statement, a soundbite, anything they could turn into tomorrow's front-page banner. But Zariah Monroe, the woman at the center of the storm, stood perfectly still. She wasn't overwhelmed. She wasn't flattered. She was thinking. Thinking about the little girls watching, the women overlooked, the quiet professionals who never got their shot because the system ran on assumptions rather than merit. And thinking, too, of that moment in the cockpit, when she'd steadied the descent with hands no one believed had the right to hold the yoke. The FAA awarded her the National Medal for Civilian Aviation Heroism. NASA invited her to speak at their next Flight Systems Summit. A National Flight Academy renamed its core scholarship program, the Zariah Monroe Initiative for Underrepresented Aviators. But what stayed with her wasn't any of that. It was the letters, thousands of them, from girls in Detroit and Dakar, from older women who once dreamed of flight, from retired pilots who'd seen her in their own daughters, and from Derek, the co-pilot, whose note simply read, "You made me a better man, a better pilot. Thank you for not waiting for permission." One afternoon, months later, she stood beside a gleaming aircraft at a youth aviation camp. The kids swarmed around her like electrons around a nucleus, bombarding her with questions. Did the other pilots apologize? Were you scared? Do you think I can fly too? She smiled, crouching to eye level with a girl barely 9. You don't need anyone else to believe in you, Zariah said gently. You just need to be ready for the moment. Because your time will come, and when it does, she tapped the girl's heart. You fly like you were born for it. That night, Zariah stood alone again. On a rooftop balcony, city below, sky above, somewhere between two worlds she'd never fully belonged to. And maybe that was the point. Maybe she was meant to carve a new path between them. She looked up and smiled, no longer ignored, no longer underestimated, but not for the fame, for the ones watching from the shadows, waiting for a sign they belonged in the sky too. And now, finally, they had it.